my mother, whose name was Florence Playstead at that time, she was from Shingle House, Pennsylvania. But she'd gone to a business college and someplace in that area, I don't know where, and became a secretary or whatever they became in those days. And she got a job at the, what they used to call the Merrill Sewell Company in Frewsburg, which was a condensed milk factory. And she came to Frewsburg, so, and became a local girl. And she told me that she was quite young. She was only about 19, I think, 18, 19. And she told me that at that time, she had known Robert Jackson because I believe it was the one of the Fenton families in Frewsburg. One of them had a big farm out just outside the village, and they had dances. And she used to go to the dance with Bob Jackson. So, yeah, but strange as it seems, she didn't know my father at that time. But I remember, to me, I was only about, but I saw him up at the Moonbrook Riding Stables. He was well-known horseman. Of course, his folks were in the livery business. And he used to ride horses. He had a horse someplace, or supposedly up in Lakewood someplace, in some stable up there. But he used to attend the horse shows that they had at the Moonbrook Riding Stable. And I had a pony at that time that I kept at the Cornell farm. And young Lucy Cornell, she was about 9, I guess, at the time. She used to take my pony and enter my pony in the pony class at the horse show. Well, of course, since it was my pony, I had to go up and see how things made out. And anyway, I was usually out at the Cornell farm anyway, most of the time. And so the one time I was over there, why, I noticed this gentleman who seemed to be sitting on the end of a stick, a walking stick. And it was the first time I had seen one of those walking sticks that they're the top, the handle splits open so to make a little seat out of them. And I'd never seen one of those things that interested me. And so I guess I was I was watching it, Bob Jackson at the time, and I didn't know it was him. But I noticed that a number of people came along and talked to him and spoke to him. So I asked somebody, I said, who was that fellow over there with that strange device? And they said, well, that's Bob Jackson. Well, then it dawned on me. I'd heard that name before, and I knew a little bit more about it. But that
Bill Lee could go. So I went to the Richburg party on the heels of my very dear friend who died within the last few months, Horace Seeley. And we went to the Richburg home at Chevy Chase. At that time, Roosevelt had appointed Richburg as head of, I recall, the NRA, I believe it was called. And his party was being held at Chevy Chase, Maryland, at his home. And he had quite a number of dignitaries there. There was Justice Robert Jackson. And I was so horribly impressed with him. He was such a gentle, kind, fair-minded man. And that has stuck with me ever since that time. And I knew when I heard the discussion today about Nuremberg that if there was anyone that was ever fair and honest about the trial, it would be Justice Jackson. And Bill Jackson was there. I thought at the time that this was his brother. Now, if I may say so, Bill was a little bit more relaxed and a little more of a party person than Justice Jackson was. He was a nice, very nice man. But also there was Thurman Arnold, who fought all of the trust-busting cases back under Roosevelt. He was
about Robert Jackson. When I went to Albany Law School, Robert Jackson was an abstraction, just like any sitting judge is now. When I went to Albany Law School, I learned very quickly that Robert Jackson was the preeminent alumni of the school. And I learned he didn't graduate from Albany Law, but he attended Albany Law. So he was the top man that they boasted about. And then subsequently, I learned that he practiced law in Chautauqua County, in particular Jamestown. So, well, he no longer was an abstract person. He was a person of intimacy. And I involved myself in learning about him. And of course, at that time, he was a preeminent legal man in the country. You know, everyone respected him, and he was outstanding. So I was anxious. So when I came back to talk to people who were his contemporaries and practiced law with him and rubbed elbows with him and had a beer with him and that sort of thing, the intimacy of that relationship, which is basic and an understanding the personnel of a man. Yes, I did attend the funeral. It was, what shall I say, cream de cream of the legal profession of the whole country. All of judges and so forth. The eulogies were what you would expect, exemplary, and extolled his talents and so forth and so on. And then I think we were permitted to mingle among the high elite, and the one man that sticks out in my mind of the assemblage was William Douglas. Could sit down and talk to him, and he was a most regular guy, just as you and I would discuss. You didn't hold him in awe, he just put you at ease, and he was the most popular justice there. Yeah. And it was quite a moving experience, I'm sure the people who knew him have described him more. I didn't know him. I may have shaked hands with him on one occasion, but not in an intimate way. But I'll tell you one episode. I was listening to my radio one night in the early morning hours, and I was startled to hear, I was trying to recall who it was, giving a talk on Robert Jackson in the early morning hours. And I don't know whether it was a retranscribed or a replay of a talk that he had given earlier that day. And so I listened with fascination, and he was quoting some of the quotations that Justice Jackson gave. And the next day I wrote him a letter. I knew he'd be pleased to know that I heard him 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning out here in the boondocks, and he had probably given that talk. I know he had given it up in New England someplace, Boston. And he responded immediately. He said, "Oh, I'm so pleased to hear that you heard my talk, especially at that hour in the morning." And then he said, "I was especially intrigued with the quotation that you gave from Robert Jackson." He said, "I assure you that I'm going to use that quotation in my next and continuing speeches on the subject." I may still have that letter. If I find it, I'll forward it to you.
Please do.
I wish I could recall the man's name. Very distinct.
Jackson, of course, I was, for the most part, a boy when he and my father were associated at the Bank of Jamestown. And Jackson did work for the Bank of Jamestown. I think at one point he was general counsel. And he always was interested in horses and belonged to the Jamestown Saddle Club. And there were a number of people whose names you would probably recognize that were also active in there. People like Fritz Magnuson and the Reels, Dora and Ruth Reel, who had horses. And during the Depression, the Saddle Club still continued to go, but it was its heyday was kind of in the 20s, I think. And they would have horse shows. Sure. And Jackson and Irene had a horse named Bluebonnet, and they also had a horse a little later on named Augusta. Bluebonnet was a black mane and tail, and she rode that. Augusta, I think he rode more, and then they had kind of an old favorite that was older. Fairmont Avenue, the pillared house that recently was sold. But they kept them up there, and then at some point in the course of the horse shows and Saddle Club days, and Jackson's would be there, and Irene would show, and he would show, although he quickly kind of stepped aside on that and let his daughter, as quickly as she could ride a horse, she began, Mary began showing.
And this was all English riding?
Right, all English riding, and 3 and 5 gated classes, and that was very much the style in those days. And old people like Walter Hazard, and he had a big black 5-gated. They had, and then people came from Warren and Bradford also, and Ludlow, the Olmsteds.
Yeah.
Show. You know who the Olmsteds?
Sure. Been down to their manor.
And then the Blairs would come to the horse show. I've forgotten whether they had horses or not, but the Blairs and the Logans, and my mother and father would be there, and Elmer Selstrom, and he was a bachelor back in those days and got married, but to Edna Lauster. But anyway, these horse shows would take place, and then
Where would they take place?
They were mostly at Moonbrook.
Moonbrook?
Mm-hmm.
Or whereabouts would that be?
Would be, you know where the Moonbrook stable is?
Oh, yes, sure, okay. Yes.
The Moonbrook stable's in private hands now, but it was all part of, they called it the Moonbrook stable.
Okay.
And it had an indoor ring. It still does, I think. I don't know what they've done to it inside, but it's a big barn. And so that's where the horse shows would be. And as a boy, I had first a pony and then a horse, and I would take place and take part in the horse shows. So I got to know Jackson through that, but then the time came when my father and my uncle, Elmer, and Bob Jackson were visiting about a piece of property that the bank had taken over, which was a stock farm in Lakewood. And that was Cowling. He was the proprietor, and he got in some financial trouble, and they bought the stock farm from the Bank of Jamestown for $5,000, and that included the barn and 88 acres. It was in the Depression, and Bob apparently decided he didn't want to try to keep the horses. They didn't have a good place to road ride, when she enjoyed them. He didn't want to keep them in his home, so my father and we had kept our horses first at the Lindbeck farm, Rendegat, castle-like looking stable
Yeah.
in the back that's now, I think, Veteran of Foreign Wars or something.
Mhm.
And then we moved to Moonbrook with our horses. And from there, Jackson's moved his horses, and Elmer moved his horse. He had one, and my father had two. And we moved them all to the stock farm there in Lakewood, and then we took in a few boarders, like Sherman Vandervoort had a horse, a gated horse, and they were all 3-gated and 5-gated show horses. And the farm was in kind of bad shape. The barn needed a lot of work, and Jackson had his two uncles, the Howitts, Dan and John Howitt, who came and helped do the work, and Jackson himself, you know, the fact that he was voted one of the 10 best men, or the best dressed men in the country at one point, that was quite an accolade in those days. You never know it because he could put on old clothes, and they were really old, and he was just another hired hand at the stock farm. We were fixing it up. We took the old cow barn there, and I say we, I was playing mostly around there. But we moved the stanchions so we could put in horse stalls. And the stanchions were hard to get out. They had big, you know, these heavy mauls, and you broke those out. I remember my father and Jackson and all of them with mauls breaking up that concrete because they were concrete stanchions for cattle. And we wanted to get it all flat so we could put in horse stalls. And
was Jackson in Washington at that time, or was he still in?
No, he was still in Jamestown when it started. Now, I can't give you the exact sequence of years, but you can check the date that they bought the farm, counsel to the Internal Revenue, I believe.
Just for the heck of it, just happened to look at a title search on Crawford Lane just the other day, and it just happened to come out.
Yeah.
1832, it looked like.
Yeah. This is the... See, my uncle wasn't married at that time, so it just ended. They misspelled my mother's name. But that's when they bought it in 1932, right in the depths of the Depression. Of course, the grocery business went on even during the Depression, and Jackson was had some good law practice with the Jamestown Telephone Company, and the telephone company went on. Up and painted the barn and made it look pretty decent. And I remember that the whole farm had been neglected and was full of goldenrod, and they set fire to the goldenrod to burn it off, and fire got out of control, and Sidney Butterfield had a place next door back up towards the Hunt Road. It went all the way to the Hunt Road, the farm did, and it burned over, and he had some pine seedlings that he planted, and it burned his pine seedlings. And Jackson and he had to settle that. So I don't know just how it was settled. But
Describe, just for the heck of it, describe Bob Jackson.
well, Jackson, as I knew him, of course, he was, for the most part, it was a recreation, and he would come up on, Irene didn't ride very much. She had a show horse, and she would go to the horse show, and she'd ride a little bit, but mostly it would be Bob and my father and my uncle and myself. I was an only child, so it was just understood that I went horseback riding every Sunday morning.
Right.
And so we'd go riding back, they were all dirt roads back of the Lakewood Road, or back of, all back, the Hunt Road was all dirt, and it was dirt all the way back to Sugar Grove, no paved roads.
Right.
And so we could ride on those dirt roads, and there were some cars, of course, but there wasn't the traffic there is today, and there wasn't the speed there is today.
Right.
So we could ride, and we'd often come out fairly early and ride to Sugar Grove and have breakfast in a little inn there in Sugar Grove. Me, Jackson, and my father, and Elmer Selstrom, and and myself, and sometimes there would be other people, and I can't tell you. Yes, we had enough horses, so various people would come along and ride, and we'd go down to Sugar Grove and have breakfast and have pancakes and syrup and sausage,
Sure.
bulk sausage. Come back, orange juice. I remember even the menu. And Jackson had quite a sense of humor, and they would visit the three of them as they rode horseback, and I would overhear them, and he would talk about current events, and they'd talk about local situation. My family were all Republicans, and he was a Democrat,
Okay.
and they didn't always agree, but they were good friends, and so that went along that way. And then when Jackson went to Washington, he commuted for quite a while, and he would have, well, the name of Don Ferguson was kind of his chauffeur, as well as Clyde Anderson, and he'd drive him to Warren to catch the train. You know, that was the way he went to Washington. There were no planes. Planes were just, I don't think we had any planes up here by that time. Anyway, he'd go to Warren, and they'd take the overnight train to Washington. And I don't know whether you had to change in Philadelphia or not, but anyway, I think it changed in Harrisburg. And one train went to Washington and one car went to Philadelphia. And so he would commute back and forth, not every weekend though. I mean, he was there, he'd stay in Washington some of the time. But I don't know how long it was that he did this, but it was quite a while. He didn't move to Washington. They took this apartment in Warden Park so that eventually, because Bill was going to St. Albans and Mary went to Cathedral School, and the apartment was in the Warden Park there, and I visited there a couple of times. I don't know what circumstance, but I think it was the Children of American Revolution one time when Frank Taylor and I went down with Lena Taylor and some other lady, and then we went to see the Jacksons, and there were occasions when we'd go to Washington and see the Jacksons and go out to Warden Park or someplace and get together with Mary and Bill. Mary was younger than I was. Bill was my contemporary, although he was a year ahead of me in school. He was a little older, I think, a few months. And but you asked what Jackson was like. Well, he had a little temper. I've seen him get awful upset with Bill. I remember when we were working on the barn up there that he had some boyfriends up. Bill did, Dick Sharp and Linda Van Black and myself, we were all there. And they brought 22 rifles. This was probably, Bill, we were probably 14, 15, or something like that. And there were windows in the one end of the barn, and so they said that to have something to shoot at, they shot out some of the windows. And I guess they were cracked anyway, but they shot out the windows. And Bill had a Crosley air rifle. It was up there for the purpose was to have it there. The reason Bob went along with it was that we had a lot of rats in the old barn, and we shot the rats.
Sure.
And that was quite a hobby, to go and sneak around and find a rat and shoot it. And
Understand.
and we got rid of the rats eventually in the barn. It was an old barn, but it served the purpose. And anyway, Bob got awful mad at Bill, and he gave him an awful dressing down, and he became very florid. And I remember trembling, even though he wasn't mad at me. I didn't have a gun, so I wasn't blamed. But
Was he a
and
tall
then
guy?
he had
Size-wise, just to picture him, was he tall? Was he? What was his
he
size?
was not terribly tall. I would say my guess would be that he was probably 5'9", 10. He wasn't tall like Bill. Bill was taller than he was, and slim. Bob was a little heavier.
Mhm.
He looked very much like the fellow that played his part
Mhm.
there in
Mhm.
Dallas Baldwin. And well, I can remember one time that I found a snake up in the pasture, and I had it by the tail. It was a little garter snake, and I came down to show it to everybody because, you know, kids.
Sure.
That's great. And Bob was definitely afraid of snakes, and he just went into a tizzy over that snake, and I had to get rid of it. And he was floored again
Yeah.
over that snake. But he was a smiley person. He smiled a lot, and he was very agreeable and pleasant company. I remember that on one of our rides down there where Baker Street, there was a cemetery, it's still there, at the corner of Baker Street and Big Tree, little old cemetery. And there was a little road into it, or right on the side of it or something, and there was a car parked there on Sunday morning. There were a couple lovers in the back seat, and they were up kind of in the cemetery. And Bob rode his horse, and we all did up to see why that car was in the cemetery and was going kind of jumping up and down. So Bob put his foot on the bumper of the car while he still was on his horse, and flexed the car a little bit on the springs, and he said, "You need any help?" And there was just deathly silence from in the car. And I said, "Apparently not." He thought that was awful funny. I didn't see why it was so funny. I guess I was pretty naive at that point. And we went on our road on our way to Sugar Grove for pancakes and sausage, Democrat. And there weren't too many Democrats around, and an awful lot of the Republican, all the establishment of the city, with the exception of John Wright and a few people, all frowned a little on Jackson because he was the Mr. Democrat, and at the time, most of the establishment here hated Roosevelt. You know, I can remember my family Sunday night suppers. That was a favorite topic about what a terrible liberal he was, and but it never affected the friendship of Jackson, and Jackson had a lot of friends, and among them I know John Blair and his wife and Warren. They were quite close, and I can't tell you exactly, except that I remember being up on my little boat with Bill one time and approaching the Alibi, which was his cruiser. They had a 4-bunk cruiser, about, I suppose it was 33 feet long, 30 feet long, something like that. I kept it up at, just towards Lakewood from Celeron, the little boathouse there. And we came up in Bainbridge Colby, and Jackson were having quite a visit on the stern of the boat. They had a little stern area, and they were talking, and we were up in the front, and Bob Jackson said, "Now, Bill, you go ahead, you boys go ahead and do what you're doing, because Mr. Colby and I want to visit." And so they were talking hard. Of course, they had a lot to talk about, I'm sure. Jackson was probably picking the former secretary to Wilson's brain. The Secretary of State he was to Woodrow Wilson. And double dated and went to parties quite a bit, and we'd go to the casino in Bemis. When they were up here summers, even after they moved to Washington, they kept their house up here for quite a while, and they'd come and spend the summer here. And Jackson would commute, and Irene and Bill and Mary would be here, and Mary, I had a horse named Worthwhile, and she liked Worthwhile, and I kind of lost interest in horses as I got to be more of a teenager and older and independent, and could drive a car, I'm going up every Saturday or Sunday to ride horseback to Sugar Grove didn't appeal to me too much. And but Mary kind of took over, and she showed worthwhile in various shows and did very well. She usually won the road hack class. Worthwhile was a bay, well, yeah, it was not a dark bay, a light bay, but three-gated, and Worthwhile could really trot. I was a member of the Round Table at 210, and Ernest Cockcroft and my father and what was the fellow's name that corresponded up to the Round Table if he had lunch open.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the Round Table one day when I was there, Jackson was there. My father would invite me occasionally, and they were always very courteous, and they said it was good to have somebody of another generation and so on. That didn't happen often, but I happened to be there. And Jackson, and I don't remember the details of why, but he had some run-in with Truman.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying, and making no bones about it, Jackson was very forthright. And he didn't play politics. It didn't matter who or what. If he thought something was right or wrong, he said it.
Right.
And he was very forthright, even while Truman was president, that he didn't think much of Harry Truman.
Right.
I don't know what the to-do was. Truman had appointed him over there to Nuremberg, and this was, I don't know whether it was before or after Nuremberg, to be honest with you. I don't remember. Truman was not the greatest guy.
The first time I remember having anything to do with the Jackson family was I was very small, very young. And we were at their home on Farmount Avenue, which I can never understand is not known as the Robert H. Jackson home. It's a beautiful home. And it just seems to me that that should somehow be memorialized. And I don't remember much about it because I was extremely young. But being there, I think we were there and had dinner with them. And I remember going out in the backyard. It seemed big and beautiful and all to a small child. That was my first recollection of Jackson. Although I'd heard my father and mother speak of Bob and Irene Jackson and so on and so forth. And of course, I got older, I knew he was a real good lawyer in town.
Mm-hmm.
But I personally didn't have any contact with him. But when I was 5 years old, I should say that was the next personal contact with him. When I was 5 years old, before I was 5, I was real sick, and I don't know whether I had pneumonia or what I had, but as a 4-year-old, and the doctor finally told my folks that he thought the best thing to do would be to get me down south somewhere where there was some warm weather and I would get over whatever I had very quickly. So we went to Puerto Rico. And I remember we took a train to New York City where my folks had a couple of friends of theirs. And our host there, where we had dinner that night, and I think we spent the night there and then took a boat the next day. And we had dinner, and that was my birthday. And that was my 5th birthday. And I'll never forget the chicken dinner we had at their home. It was terrific. And Mr. Lockwood, Clark Lockwood was his name. His father was a very well-known, able lawyer in Jamestown years before. And then we went to Puerto Rico, and we got down there, and Bob and Irene Jackson were also in Puerto Rico. Now, I don't know if they knew it in advance, either the Jacksons or us, but during the time we were in Puerto Rico, I did quickly get well and ran around. In fact, on the boat down there, I was supposed to take it easy and not go up and down the stairs, but everyone else in the family got sick, and I was getting better, so I would go up the stairs on the boat and then slide down the rail. And I remember that. We got down there, and I remember this particular occasion. I guess I told you about it. When the Jacksons and Booties, and I was the only kid that was there, were down on the ocean, but nobody had bathing suits on. I don't know what we were doing down there, but anyway, my dad or mother had a camera, and so they thought it'd be nice to have a picture of the four of them. And I said, let me take the picture. I'd never taken the picture. My dad said, you think you can? I said, sure. And he gave me the camera, and he said, now, be sure and get it centered and hold it very steady and so on, and when you get everything just right, push down here. So I said, okay. So the Jacksons and the Boobies stood up there, the four of them, and I got it all lined up, and I pushed down, and my dad, oh, Bob, he said, you had your finger over the lens. I said, no, I didn't. He says, yes, you did. He said, take another one and make sure you don't have it, your finger over it. And instead of advancing the thing, he said, you had your finger over, so just go ahead and take another right there. So I did. And then they said, I think that was all right, but if there's any question in your mind, let's take a third one. So I took a third one. And the first two, the first one was a double exposure. So it was like this. The third one was all right.
Yeah.
Now, I never threw away that double exposure, and I would have given anything if I could find that.
Yeah.
This morning, my wife was looking again for it, and she found a couple interesting letters that I have with me, but she didn't find that picture. But
Bob Booty may have not found the pictures of which he took, but here are some pictures that were taken of him in Puerto Rico. Here's a picture of young Bob Booty together with Robert Jackson in Puerto Rico. Another picture of Robert Jackson together with young Bob Booty. Of Irene and Robert Jackson together with Robert Booty's brother, John.
Sandra Day O'Connor was here for the dedication of the statue. I went up and talked to her, and I told her about the picture taking and so on, and she got a big kick out of that. In college, I went to Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, Virginia, and I don't know what the occasion was, but there was a dance, a prom, or something some weekend, and I was thinking it may have been a graduation, but it apparently was 1938, and my graduation would not have been in 38. That would have been my second year there. I apparently wrote a letter to Mary Jackson inviting her to come to the prom. And when I talked to you, I didn't know what happened except she couldn't come. And but among the letters this morning that my wife was going through, there was a letter from Jackson himself. My dear Bob. Now that's interesting too,
Yeah.
that he called me Bob. You know, a lot of people who don't know me very well call me Robert, which kind of provoked me. But he said, my dear Bob, I'm gonna put on my Coca-Cola glasses. I was out of the city when your letter to Mary came to the office, and I'm sorry that I did not get it to her much sooner. I will look forward to seeing you. With best wishes, sincerely, Robert Jackson. that she had gotten my letter or something, but and she was replying by a phone call because she just got it and so on, and she regretted that she had other plans for that weekend or something, I don't know. And then here's a letter. This is dated February 15th, 1938. It's addressed to my father. My 1938. It's addressed to my father. My grandfather's was known by the name of Ed Booty. My father, with the same name, was called Ned, and I, with the same name, went by my middle name. See, that's why it's E. Robert. And my son, my oldest son, who's in Baltimore, he's the fourth, and we didn't know what to call him. And somebody said Ted, and I said, well, gee, that's a nickname for a Theodore. And they said, what about Ted Kennedy and name 2 or 3 other Teds? I said, that's fine. I like the nickname Ted, but I don't necessarily care for Theodore. And so he's always been by the name of Ted. But this says, Dear Ned, I appreciate your letter very much. Well, and this is when he was Assistant Attorney General. While there will be some delay and considerable conversation, I expect that confirming will not be withheld. That was for Solicitor General. He said, the Solicitor Generalship I regard to be the highest prize in the whole government service, which is interesting. I never knew that I don't ever remember seeing this letter. For a lawyer who likes advocacy, I hope I shall be able to fill it so as to justify the good opinion of you and my fellow lawyers. I noted by the papers that Mary, that's my mother, is south and hope she will have a pleasant trip. We often speak of our trip to Puerto Rico. So this, of course, was written long after we were in Puerto Rico. With best regards and good wishes to you and Mary, in which Irene joins. Sincerely yours, Bob. And that I thought was a nice. Want to look at it?
That's great. I'm glad you kept those.
Yeah, same here.
He was Assistant Attorney General at the time, and he'd been appointed subject to
Confirmation.
as Solicitor General.
Yeah.
Oh, isn't that nice?
And I thought it was kind of interesting that Bob Jackson, when he was here, and he practiced here, he represented big clients, corporate clients, and banks, and so on. And it seemed to me that his practice was along the lines of big money interests. And at least that's what we hear about. And then when he got to Washington, and he was a Democrat here. He was the leading Democrat, and he was a well-known Democrat in Democratic circles throughout the state. And certainly Roosevelt knew of his expertise and ability as a lawyer, not necessarily one who advocated the same policies that Roosevelt had, but as a lawyer advocating his client's position. And so I can understand why he would have brought Jackson to Washington. And then when he was a Solicitor General and representing the government in arguing cases before the United States Supreme Court, I thought it was interesting that he was now representing big government, and particularly where before he went in that position, he was in the antitrust division, which seemed to me he was still showing expertise, but kind of on the other side, which I thought was very interesting. I think that he was a graduate of Albany Law School, and he gave the commencement address at my college. I was not at that address. I did not hear. Um, he also gave the commencement address at Albany Law School the year I graduated. And probably the next time I had any personal contact with him was at a bar association meeting over in the hotel. And I don't know what the occasion was that he was here, why he was here, but anyway, he was there. And I had the good fortune of sitting at a table over there, at the same table where he was. I don't remember who else was at the table, and that didn't particularly matter, but I was one of maybe 5 sitting there. And I can't remember what it was that came up, the subject of a presidential proclamation or a request or something. And I think that it was about declaration of war. And he said the president, but he was Attorney General at the time, and I didn't check to see when he was Attorney General, but it was during that period. And he said that the president, the subject of Roosevelt came up, and there was a discussion of it. And he said Roosevelt was very able man, and he said, and it's not the people he has around him. He himself has an extreme amount of ability and so on and so forth. And he said an example. He said to me, I want you to draft a resolution or a proclamation or something declaring war and get it to me as quickly as you can. And Jackson said, well, I said, just what do you want in that declaration? And Roosevelt took a piece of paper and said, well, something like this, and he scribbled 2 or 3 sentences. And he said, something like that. And he gave it to Jackson, and Jackson said, I took it to the office, and I struggled and worked, and I tried writing things. And I got all through, and I said, I can't improve on what he wrote. And that's what it was.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Entertaining Jackson's at your house, and you told that story the other day, and it was a fabulous one.
Well, I felt from the very beginning that he was a benefactor to us. And the fact that he had such a loving, friendly personality really impressed me and brought out the best in me. And so we bonded. And he would come when we were expected to be at the court for something. We had no car. We were struggling. And he would come in his roadster and pick us up, which I thought was sensational, and the neighbors thought it was just unheard of. They, first of all, our neighbors doubted that that was Jackson, and I said yes, and that Jim was doing his clerkship. And so that's the way he conducted himself for us. So when you have that type of relationship with a person, you want to reciprocate. And the custom was that we should have them for dinner. And so I had Justice Jackson. I never called him the boss, which we did privately. To me, he was Mr. Justice. No matter how he called me Antoinette, we always called him, and I trained my children to say Mr. Justice. So we had them, and his wife, Irene, was a lovely person. I need to tell him about the first dinner, Jim?
Is that the birthday dinner?
Yes.
Sure.
No, about the first time we had them in our home.
Sure.
She was noted to be a Southern cook, good cook. And I wasn't a bad cook, but I didn't think I was a good cook. So I was going to make strawberry shortcakes. And I was going to make them from scratch. No biscuit, no nothing like that, which I was accustomed to doing. So I did, and they flopped. And she was there, encouraging me, saying it happened to her all the time, which I knew it hadn't. And so we went on with our dinner, and it was just a joyful, wonderful time. They came to our home, in Falls Church twice. So how can you describe a man like that in professional terms? You just can't. You're talking to a personality which is really outstanding. And then if you're smart, you're thinking about the professional attributes that this man has and how he's come up to this high degree of service with the same lack that your dear darling husband has. And I felt that Jim had always felt that maybe his lack of undergraduate work would be a handicap to him. And I felt that this was the beginning of his career, and it was. You know, it opened doors for him, and our dear Justice made him a big deal, and it made us feel like he was a big deal. So on those terms, you could only judge a man like that by a personal relationship. And I think that was why yesterday was so poignant for us, because he felt that his time was short, but he was dogged in his pursuit of doing his job, and I liked that about him. He was very, very special.
Actually wrote a couple letters to your daughters.
Oh, he was very involved. That sounds a little bit like bragging, but as Jim
Okay.
always says, if it's true, it isn't bragging. So yes, he came to our home in Falls Church. He came to our home in Germantown. I think at that point, he was coming up for your fraternity meeting, PAD. And then he came for the for the Pennsylvania bar, and he took us out to dinner. And he was going to show this little country girl how to eat a lobster. Well, by that time, I knew that I was very allergic to shellfish, but I ate some of the lobster.
That's devotion.
I just couldn't say no to him, and he was so pleased that he was doing something different. We were born inland, and where we come from, you don't get these delicacies. So he ordered this big lobster, and I prayed all through dinner and picked at it, and I did a creditable job. I didn't feel so hot afterwards, but it was worth it. So that was, yes, he was very much involved with our two girls. And when he was in the hospital, I think we urged them that he, you know, oh, they loved him too, and the boss is ill. It would be nice if you sent him a nice little note, and he responded immediately. Those letters are precious.
I've seen copies of them, yeah.
Yeah,
They're really
those
good.
letters are precious. So, from my point of view, he really was our hero. And he turned out to be a hero that you could love, that you could admire, and that you could wish would live forever.
Oh, that's terrific. Tell me quickly about Irene. Describe her.
She was a gracious Southern lady, and I used to think I wanted to ask,
She was the Southern
but she
lady.
wasn't really Southern lady. I thought she was a Southern lady, and Julia last night was telling me that she had all the Southern attributes. She was hospitable, she was compassionate, as he was, empathetic, and just the fact that these two people would come to the law clerk's house for dinner, just as my, you know, I grew older, a little bit more sophisticated, just baffles my mind. But there was a big occasion, and she came, and she's tall, I think of medium height, but pretty. She was pretty, and I was just captivated by her. Mostly not by her looks, but her demeanor and the way she really related to the justice. And I thought they had a very, very nice relationship. I was also fascinated with the idea that she's without doing her thing, because she was very close to Jacqueline Cochran, the aviatrix. And at the time of this birthday party that we had at Elsie's apartment, she couldn't get home in time. And so she wasn't there, and she phoned, and she was most gracious.
in 1939. He was killed in a boating accident on Chautauqua Lake. He and his brother both. And I was an only child, and so Crawford Barger took me under his wing and would find things to do. And he, at that time, with Jackson, owned the Lakewood Riding Stables. And I think they acquired that. I think they held the mortgage on it, and something happened, and anyway, they acquired the stable, because Crawford at that time owned all the land. The stable was located where Grazier's is now. He owned all the land from Fairmount all the way to Hunt Road. And he sold it off for building lots over the years. So he wanted to get me as much activity as he could, so he took me on Saturdays up there and said he was going to have somebody teach me to ride a horse. And that somebody happened to be Robert Jackson.
I'll be darned.
And so I can remember so well, I was 9 years old. I remember him introducing me, and I said, you know, how do you do, Mr. Jackson? He said, now look, if I'm going to be teaching you and we're going to be friends, he said, I want you to call me Uncle Bob. So that's what I did. I called him Uncle Bob. And at that time, I think he was in Washington, but he was coming home weekends. And he was home about every weekend, and so just about every, I don't know how many weeks it was, but I would meet him at the stable. And sometimes he would put me on the horse and let me go a little by myself. Other times he'd get on with me and ride. And of course, I had no idea at that time that he would become the famous person that he was. But I'll always remember that. You know, he was such a nice fellow.
Well, I joined the Legion, and they had an honor guard, and they asked me if I wanted to be in it, and I told them yes. Well, first the honor guard commander called you line up in a row, and he called you to attention.
You were asked to participate in a funeral service in October of 1954, which involved Justice Jackson.
Yes, down in Frewsburg.
What do you recall of that day?
It was a terrible day. It was raining and bad, real bad. And we had uniforms, Legion uniforms, and raincoats. When they're taking the casket out of the hearse, we stand on each side of the walk. They walk to the grave,
Right.
6 on each side. I forget what they call that maneuver.
Now, did you stand there when they, in Jackson's case, when the casket came out of the hearse, did you stand there?
Yeah, not right where they come out, but there's like a little path or something.
Right.
That we stood beside that. It was,
So the casket came right by you,
yeah,
and then they laid it on the, I assume, the
yeah, they have,
vault there.
we were marching two lines, and we walk away from it. He calls for ready, aim, and fire 3 times, and then the bugler plays taps, and the firing squad stands at salute, which is just holding the rifle out in front of you like that. And then when it was all over, I kind of walked down. We were quite a ways from the casket and the hearse, and I kind of wanted to see who was there, you know, not the, if I could spot any of the other judges from the Supreme Court, and I could see about 5 or 6 of them, but I couldn't see their face well enough to, or didn't know them well enough to say who they were.
What kind of crowd would there have been at the internment service? Did you get a sense whether was it 20, 30, or was it 100 people, or a big crowd?
Well, it was, like I say, it was a terrible day. I would say it was no more than 50. My dad knew Bob Jackson.
Is that right?
The father used to be, he worked for the city, and he was the assessor.
Right.
And I don't know just how he knew him, but I can remember when he got on the Supreme Court, my dad said something about it, that he knew him. It was a long time ago,
Oh, yeah.
but it was something I remembered.